I trust you're aware of how fragile this connection is. We lose Ally, we lose you. I suppose others lose me, and just so you know. So
Oh,
I've had to fill in some blanks. I'm hoping that maybe when Ally can hit her stride, maybe we'll be okay.
yeah. I haven't been having any
You
issues,
know,
but I
so
mean, that's also just online world. Um, so, very briefly, I will say that I have known Dr. Alexandra Cirone since we were in fifth grade in 1994 is when I met her. We went to middle school and high school together, and we both graduated in the top of our class. She was higher than me, though. And then she went, because you were tied salutatorian, I think, and I was all the way down number 8 in the class. So
all right, girls.
a real slacker. Um, so then Allie went on to go to school in Chicago and then many other great places around the country and the world. So some of you may have attended her talk in Zurich or Basel when she came 3 years ago, and we were able to meet in person back then. But obviously, fake news has not stopped being an issue, and politics has not really gotten more sane. So we thought it would be nice to have her come back and tell us how things are changing and maybe give us some tips on how to handle fake news that's being spread around. So I will let her give a more academic introduction of herself. And yeah, so here's Allie.
Okay, great. Well, thanks to Liz and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be back virtually. I remember my time with both camps, both the Zurich and the Basel camps, very fondly. I had a great time last time I visited. From what I can remember, that Kier was strong, but it was an amazing group, and I'm really happy to be back. So today, what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about fake news, some of the recent events, and then a couple things that I think are missing from the discourse on fake news that we know from the academic side, and all of you probably know from just being users of social media. But in attempts to kind of tie the two populations together, Liz gave me free reign, so I decided to pick the cool topics that I wanted to talk about. So it'll be relatively informal. I'll talk for about a half an hour with slides, and then happy to do open Q&A. So again, I'm faculty at Cornell. I'm an assistant professor in the government department. At Cornell, I teach the course on fake news, so it's my responsibility to teach undergraduates how to deal with this new kind of changing social media environment. But I also do kind of a lot of media consulting on fake news institutions. And so, if you have any other questions about what the heck is going on in politics, feel free to toss those into the Q&A. I recently ended a short course for the London School of Economics where I teach the civil servants over there in the executive MBP, and that was right after the insurrection at the Capitol. So they had lots of interesting questions. So that is also fair game. I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. But first, we'll talk about fake news. So go ahead and set up my slides. Okay, so the last time I was here, I told you about fake news, right? Now, the definitions keep kind of evolving as we see new types of fake news, but the core definition is still the same. Fake news is lies, deceptions, hoaxes that appear to be news that contradict the best available evidence and written with the intent to mislead. And fake news, oh wait, it says sharing is paused, hold on. This might be the internet connection issue. Let me try and flip this up again. Okay, is that back?
Yep, yeah, I can see it.
Okay, right, that happens again, apologies. I'm also in the middle of upstate New York, so it might be my connection, that's the problem. Okay, so fake news is used to describe everything, propaganda, conspiracy theories, but in particular, in the past 4 years under the Trump administration, it was typically invoked to describe news that people don't agree with or like. And so this was a particularly worrying development because there are fake news, as in fake news reports designed to trick people. And then there are policies that folks might not agree with or might not want to enact, but they're calling them fake news, opposed to saying this is not a policy that I want to support. And so this was what we knew last time I was here. Now we've gotten a little bit more sophisticated in terms of how we define things, right? So, and a lot of times when we're trying to study the effects of fake news, how they're influencing voters, how they're influencing politicians, how these stories are spreading throughout the ecosphere, it's important to distinguish between misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation is just information that's incorrect. And this can actually be innocuous. So particularly with policy, for example, Brexit, sometimes things are hard to quantify. We might not know the cost of the UK leaving the European Union, or we might not know necessarily to what extent you can spread COVID if you've already been vaccinated, right? And so sometimes, we make our best guess, we make our best estimate. It might be wrong, but importantly, the folks putting out that information, we're not trying to mislead you. Disinformation, on the other hand, is a type of misinformation, but this is where the person was trying to trick you, right? It's classified by intent. And we're seeing the rise of disinformation on social media for a lot of different reasons, multiple outlets, few gatekeepers, anyone can be on the internet, fake accounts, all of these contribute to the fact that disinformation is on the rise. And then a lot of political science research tries to figure out to what extent does having disinformation floating around affect and generate misperceptions. Right? So, these are beliefs that are false and contradict the best available evidence. And we're really worried that misinformation, mainly disinformation, might lead people to hold misperceptions, might change their minds and lead them to believe something is not true, like, misinformation, disinformation on COVID, leading folks to believe that the vaccine is, a conspiracy theory by Bill Gates to control us all, right? Okay, so those are kind of the issues that we're dealing with. And generally, fake news is even more of a problem than when I spoke to you last. And folks are also aware that it's a problem. And so we're doing more surveying of populations to see how they use social media, what they think about fake news, and to what extent people think that they see it, right? And so this is by Pew, a really reputable polling/research think tank. And they asked Americans in 2020, so this was right before the election, what are the big problems facing your country today? And now, among and even above a whole bunch of things that are really important, fake news is now making the cut, making the list of things that individuals are worried quite a bit about, over things like racism, immigration, terrorism, and crime. Now, the gap between the rich and the poor, that's an economic indicator, healthcare, those are still beating fake news in terms of what people are concerned about. But fake news is now in the top 10 of things that Americans are worried about. And this is not just restricted to the US. So Reuters, if any of you are interested in global trends in digital news, Reuters and Oxford put together a yearly report where they do a country by country snapshot. It's really great. And this is where this data comes from. And what they can do is they ask the same question in all these different countries so they can get a comparative view on, questions on fake news. And so this question in particular was the proportion that's concerned about what's real and what's fake. So if you're concerned, so this is the percentage of individuals concerned in a lot of different countries. If you zoom in a little bit, I know this graph is annoyingly long, and so it's hard to get in. It ranges from, 84% of folks in Brazil are concerned. The US had high concern. And again, this was in 2020, this was before the presidential election, down to other folks that are not as concerned. So, Italy's gone down, not too bad. Some folks also, this graph highlights that the concerns are a function of specific, this is the other. Let me try to go back. Okay. As you can see, they're a function of specific events. So the UK, Brexit, now that Brexit was done, they're not as worried about fake news. Hong Kong was facing violent street protests. And anytime there's a significant event in the country, this is also ripe for fake news, right? So some of these are being driven by country-specific factors, But what this graph shows is that, between 84 to 40% of individuals all over the world know about fake news, and it's on their radar as something that they're worried about. Okay, so this is a global phenomenon, even though the US is a very salient case of this. Okay, so now going to the next graph. Okay, and this is related. So the first graph that I showed you was the percentage of people who are worried about fake news. This is the proportion that agree they can trust news most of the time, okay? And this is really important because in democratic theory, the trust of the media and the trust of news sources is really important to make democracies function, right? Because voters need to be informed, voters need to be able to kick the bastards out if politicians, renege on their promise or are corrupt or do bad things. And, the free market of ideas, the founding fathers in the US knew this when they were constructing a democracy. There needed to be outside sources of information. The government can't just control it all, right? And so we know, and this is even worse. So again, check out the y-axis. So in between half to, in the 20s over there, agree that they can trust news most of this time. So only half of the people, at most, Finland is actually, and this is going down, Finland, half of them think that they can trust the news, the rest not, right? 30% of folks, 29% of people in Italy trust their news, right? Which means 71% don't trust their news. And so the undermining of trust in mainstream media is also pretty concerning because, again, this is an important function of democratic kind of institutions. Okay, and what we've seen, so why fake news is a problem is because more people are getting their news from social media. Social media companies are for profit. First Amendment rules do not apply to companies, right? For-profit individuals. They're governed by their, executives of board of trustees and the terms of use, right? So, and we'll talk about this later. We can talk about this in the Q&A. Twitter and Facebook have, been super active at kicking people off and deplatforming users. But what's important is that these platforms were not designed to be aggregators of the news. They were designed to be able to look at children or look at your grandchildren or to say hi to a friend from high school, right? They were community-based social organizations. And now, as you can see, this is, again, a Pew graph. Folks are getting their news from platforms that were not designed to be gatekeepers, to hold up ethical standards, to be appropriate aggregator of the news. And Facebook isn't particularly bad. So Facebook has always, they inculcate fake news, they spread it, they're not very good at cracking down on it, they don't seem to care. One of the biggest contributors to this problem is Facebook. It has been for the past, decade. It's going to be so for probably the next decade. But as you can see, these are the percentage of adults who, oh, go ahead.
Can you enlarge the slides at all?
Yeah.
No, thank you.
Perfect.
And also I can give you these slides too, so Liz can distribute them if you want to look at them later. That might be easier. That's the downside of Zoom, is that everything is so small. Okay, so the percentage of adults who use the site, and this is actually interesting because if you are a user of these platforms, you feel like everyone else uses them. But that's not necessarily the case, right? Especially when it comes to Twitter. So as an academic, Twitter is actually a professional thing. We're expected to be on Twitter. We have to be careful of what we say on Twitter. But really, 25% of the US population is on Twitter. That is an incredibly small amount. So the average person is not really using Twitter. And of those, only 15% use it for news, right? And so Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, to a certain extent, Reddit. The point of this graph is to show you that non-trivial proportions of the population are getting regular news from this. So this is not just, your aunt posts a news story about COVID on the feed and you happen to see it. This is, you go to these platforms to get your news. And so this is concerning for a lot of reasons. And some of this has to do with the collapse of local journalism. So papers are shutting down and firing journalists all over the place. The New York Times is not shutting down, but the Kansas Daily News is. And that used to be a reliable source of information for local residents. Kansas Daily News is done, they turn to social media and then could potentially get tricked, right? So this is something we've seen a huge rise in, is that more people are getting their news from places that aren't designed to be accurate or ethical conveyors of the news. And then half of Americans get news on social media at least sometime, right? So often versus sometimes. I mean, there are individuals, they tend to be older individuals who, never get news from social media. And if you wonder where they get their news from, it's TV, right? So it's their local news channel, it's the cable news channels, right? And then there are some that don't get digital news, but overwhelmingly in this internet obsessed world, half of Americans are getting some form of news from social media sometimes. So this is not just an isolated problem. Okay, so news consumption is up. And this is just a quick cheat sheet. I'm not going to go over the various studies that tell us this, but this is what we know so far. The proportion of fake news producers and consumers is actually still small. So it's not the case, even though we hear about troll farms, we think that everyone's making things up. The people who are creating the stories with the intent to share them and the people who are retweeting like crazy, it's still a relatively small proportion of the population. And they tend to be concentrated on the right. There can be left-leaning fake news sites, but we're talking about Breitbart is making stuff up, and then a small population of conspiracy theorists are retweeting, right? So this is helpful to understand that the majority of fake news is coming from a very small group of people. That's not to say that you or I can't see the fake news they produce and accidentally share it, but in terms of where it's originating, it's a really small proportion of users. Now, we also know, after a few more years of academic research, is that people on the internet, normal users of social media, they're relatively smart. You can tell when fake news shows up on your feed. Users will respond to fact checking. So if they retweet something and someone tells them, nope, you're wrong, this was the actual truth, folks do acknowledge, they do update their beliefs. It's not necessarily that everyone is being fools and falling for everything they see, especially, again, if you think about who's using media the most, these tend to be younger generations who they're media savvy, right? They know what sponsored advertising looks like. They know clickbait. They grew up with it, right? So it's not as dire. Folks will listen. Folks will change their mind. Health misinformation, which I won't really get into here, but FYI, it's much more prevalent than political fake news. So peaches cause cancer, or drink bleach and you won't get COVID. That is, political fake news is maybe 20% of the fake news ecosystem. Health fake news is about 70%. So health fake news was always an issue, wasn't really focused on, but now in the age of COVID, it's becoming an increasing concern. And these are kind of the population that seeks out strange homeopathic remedies and the population that are QAnon followers. Sometimes they overlap, but sometimes they're different. And so it's important to disaggregate that, and kind of we're working on that now. Finally, as all of you have seen, fake news is spreading in extremist groups, okay? And in particular, extremist groups are using fake news to help gain followers and to help justify action in the real world. So here, this is where kind of these anonymous Twitter trolls are now breaking out of their shell and going to attack Capitol buildings, right? And so that is something we're concerned about, because again, the average person, even if they see fake news, they won't fall for it. But if fake news is leading, is helping terrorist groups and extremist groups coordinate, then this is bad. And so we're going to talk about the Capitol in a bit. So one of the things that I was doing during the 2020 election, and again, it was because my partner was the data scientist at the DNC, they were tracking groups on Facebook and groups on social media. And so they were doing a lot of very cool programming and narrative tracking. So when they were listening, they were scraping all of these groups, getting the data and seeing what they said. And the DNC was doing this for a bunch of different states. So in Michigan, they were listening to what all of the opposition groups were saying, in public, what they were saying publicly on groups, on pages, on Twitter. And it was super interesting because a lot of the DNC national messaging had nothing to do with what Michigan was talking about. Michigan was responding to, fake news about China, not fake news about Hunter Biden, right? And so the ability to kind of understand how this varies by region is going to be really important for winning future elections, because there's different fake news in different localities. Because Michigan, they're farmers, they're industry workers, they cared about tariffs. They didn't necessarily care about, the social kind of fake news that was going on in the election. But in any case, so DNC was monitoring groups that spread fake news, and what they would do is they would flag it to Facebook and Twitter, because the campaigns had a backline to say, look, this is false, this is about election fraud, this is about hate speech, take it down, Facebook, right? And so then Facebook, would take this and then they would pull it, right? Facebook has its own internal teams, but it's unclear now whether Facebook was just not doing its duty or there was just too much to keep up with. I don't know the answer to that question. I can speculate later while not being recorded. But this was an important, role that the DNC was trying to stay on top of fake news so it wouldn't spread, so it wouldn't cause people to misunderstand where their polling place was, right? And the Stop the Steal group got a lot of attention because this is an example of a group that spontaneously formed as a result of fake news. Fake news being that the election was rigged, right? That there was widespread electoral fraud, which there was not. And I could go into all the reasons why we know that there was not, but there was not. And luckily, this is a Democratic audience, so I don't have to do that politely or otherwise. Anyway, so this was an example of fake news created a narrative that then was a rallying cry. And so the Stop the Steal groups started on Facebook with this idea that they were going to protest, they were going to give money to the Trump campaign to, fight this. And they riled each other up by saying the election was stolen. All of these things were, bad, right? But this jumped exponentially right after the election, right? So it went from 2,000 members to 300,000 members. Some of these members were real individuals with grievances. Some of them were not, right? Some of them were fake accounts, troll accounts that were, jumping in to aggravate American citizens and to stir the pot, right? But in any case, this grew exponentially. Facebook took it down. It had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of followers. And in these comments, so I spent a lot of time in the election helping them, going through the comments and flagging stuff. And it was really nasty. This was, let's go attack politicians, let's go attack the Capitol, let's do all sorts of stuff. Like the incentives, and some of it might be cheap talk, but there was a lot of clear hate speech, incitements to violence, and spreading information that was debunked by Facebook's own internal kind of fact checkers, right? So Facebook takes it down, multiplies. It's like whack-a-mole. Various other Stop the Steal groups started, and Facebook was having problems, taking them down. And what's interesting is that in preparation of the election, all social media platforms had tagged keywords, tagged users, tagged specific narratives so they could be taken down. This one they didn't anticipate, right? There was nothing to say that Stop the Steal would have been a hashtag that you need to ban on Facebook until a group formed, grew large, started violating the terms of conditions, and then had to be banned. But in the space that it took this to happen, it was about a week. And all of a sudden you had you had groups that were much more coordinated than they ever could be before. They moved to Parler, they moved to Signal, they moved to private groups using this network that they had already created, right? So that was bad. That was bad. And of course, we all know what happened is that they also tapped into QAnon, which is a conspiracy theory-based cult that is now considered to be a domestic terrorist group by the FBI, because these are the ones that are organizing assassination attempts on officials. These are the ones that are trying to bomb or, put racist hate graffiti on churches and synagogues and stuff. I mean, really, really bad stuff. QAnon also got into Stop the Steal. And then we had the Capitol insurrection, right? So no doubt fake news helped lead to the incidents at the Capitol. Elites also helped to cause the insurrection. This is really bad for democracy. This is why, political scientists haven't gotten sleep in the past couple months. But more so than just fake news and online communities organizing, a domestic terror attack, that's bad enough. But what's even worse is that this could have been prevented if elites would have spoken out against the unifying narrative, which was the electoral fraud, right? So if individuals in high-level positions of power would have said, no, this is not true, that would have helped. And then if social media companies would have cracked down on the proliferation of, violent organizing, that also would have helped, right? But the Capitol insurrection was a very clear example of how fake news can have real life consequences, and that there needs to be kind of more regulations on these platforms. But I'm gonna, this is basically what I just said. But yeah, so the electoral fraud here was the mechanism, it was the misinformation, but fake news exists and people can deal with it, but it becomes more problematic when elected officials and institutions don't denounce the fake news. Because if they were denouncing the fake news, what we know from everything, from academic research, from past instances of this, it's these groups, it's relatively difficult to get them off the internet to go do something on a large scale, but it's made much easier if the governing party is complicit and lets them, right? Okay, so I'm gonna end by talking about kind of new developments, because it's important to understand kind of two new things that are causing fake news and are actually much more salient in understanding why it's a problem in society than just thinking, Russian troll farms are creating clickbait, right? Because, if you rewind to 2016, that's what we thought, right? We thought that there was fake news, there were foreign actors trying to influence, but, on average, most people didn't fall for it. And it was just something, something that the tech platforms needed to monitor, but not deal with. But now we realize that there's more fundamental things. And one of these are elites. So the role of elites in creating this problem. And there's the other big thing is media literacy and identity politics, right? And so these are the two things that are really the punchlines, but they're not covered. They're not covered in the news. They're not covered nearly as much as they should. Okay, so on elites, so Trump was deplatformed after the Capitol insurrection, 2 days after, and online misinformation. So we track this, right? We have various coded tools to keep track of all this internet and kind of, track it over time. And misinformation plunged 73% because of one account. Now, you know this, I know this, everyone knew that Trump was a problem on Twitter. But the important thing is that even though it was one account, it was responsible between, the initial tweets and then the retweeting of all the followers for the overwhelming majority of fake news on the platforms, right? And so elites with large number of Twitter followers and in high profile positions really make fake news worse, right? If elites weren't picking it up and spreading it, it would be, again, confined to these very small right-wing groups that are just talking to each other, right? But elites give fake news a platform. And this is also something that I don't think we realized over the past 3 years. One, that anyone would be crazy enough to do this, right? That high-ranking officials would act in such a way, and that a large group of them would, right? There's always going to be an individually, erratic politician. There's always going to be, folks in positions of power that don't know what's going on or use them for ill, right? But here it's a widespread phenomenon. In the US, it's focused in one party, not this party. Okay, and so what we know, though, is that elites play a crucial role in doing other things to society, right? So not just kind of spreading, amplifying fake news, but them acting badly in front of everyone on social media actually causes really nasty results for society. And so Brian Schaffner is a really impressive professor. He studies American public opinion. And so since 2016, he's been tracking fake news, attitudes, and he wrote an entire book on, what he calls kind of the Trump effect, which had to do with Trump says bad stuff in public No one corrects him, or none of his party, none of the other people in high places don't really go against him, although, on the left they were. This encourages other people to act badly, right? Kind of opens Pandora's box. If the president of the United States can say prejudiced things, can say racist things, all of the folks who are borderline racist now come out of the woodwork, and they think it's okay to say these things, right? And so this is experimental work, which is great. So it used randomized control trials to come up with this. It's, I won't go into that, but this is the methodology that we know we're actually isolating the effect that we need. So being exposed to prejudice rhetoric means you're more likely to express prejudice themselves, right? And this goes from folks who are already like that to folks who really weren't like that, but for whatever reason changed their mind. They see that it's cool to be macho. They, like belonging to a group that is not politically correct. There are lots of kind of reasons for it, but mass public takes their cue from elites. So Trump speaking very nasty things for the past 4 years has made it more likely that everyday individuals will be like that, right? And so this is a huge effect, right? Because his reach was enormous. His reach was to most of the American population. So elites have a role in fake news. And the thing is that if elites condone hate speech, bad actors will follow. But when elites stay silent, it also gives permission. So the fact that the Republican Party is not, let's for a moment put aside, there's a small group of super extremist Republican Congress people that got elected in this cycle. Putting them aside, if you go back to mainstream Republicans like Romney, like McConnell, depending on which state you come from, there are different types of Republican elites, but in any case, they do all belong to a weak party, and they're not speaking against electoral fraud. They're not speaking against any of the lies that are coming out. They're staying silent, right? Hoping that Trump will go away, hoping this will pass, hoping that they don't have to go on record, keeping their options open, right? This also is super problematic, right? So you can't fix everyone. And the fact that there are QAnon groups and they're using Facebook and social media to amplify their really scary messages, that's going to be hard to fix because we can't govern private companies, right? You cannot, cite First Amendment rights to deal with them. You have to you have to use all sorts of other regulation. But if elites would stop enabling fake news, the world would be kind of much better. This was an interesting academic study I thought I'd share with you guys. So we need elites to stop helping and enabling fake news, but generally just how we interact with each other on these social media platforms. There was this really funny study, it was a great study with a funny title, Treatment Effects on the Tweeted. Treatment effects on the treated is language of kind of RCTs. And so what this experiment did was on Twitter, they were studying the use of racist tweets, right? And they did an experiment where every time they saw a racist tweet, they would have a bot, right? So an automated Twitter account sanction the racist tweet. So they would say, hey, stop saying that. Stop being racist on Twitter. And it was an experiment, it was an academic study that varied the identity of the bot that was doing the sanctioning, right? So they did a white male identity with a lot of followers, that was one treatment, versus a female bot with not a lot of followers, that was another treatment, to see, does this reduce racist harassment on Twitter, right? And so this is what this looks like. Okay, so this is the bad tweet. Someone's using a racial expletive, right? Here, this was the bot. So the bot immediately sees that racial tweet, responds and says, hey man, just remember there are real people who are hurt when you harass them with that kind of language, right? Sure enough, when you sanction people on Twitter, it has an effect. It reduces this guy's tweeting behavior. I actually am not sure who knows if this is a person or a bot or a Russian troll, right? But this account's tweeting behavior will go down if they're sanctioned. However, one interesting thing about the study is, you know what the most effective sanction was? A white male with lots of followers, right? So this echoes traditional power dynamics, right? Where, elites who happen to be white and have an influential following, those are the ones that can do the most. So if they're speaking out, individuals listen. While, if we all go around and try to check people on Twitter, it might work, but not nearly at the scale if someone important uses their power for good. So, okay, so anyway, so that's the first thing, is that we never thought, or at least the fact that elites are enabling fake news, elites are calling things fake when they're not, is a huge problem. And it's even more problematic than Russian interference or fake accounts, right? Fake accounts, spam accounts, clickbait, all of that we can deal with. It was never causing super big problems, but elites are causing the problem. And the second thing I'll end with talks about media literacy, right? Because a lot of fake news policy focuses on giving users more information, right? Corrective information, fact checks, databases where you can go to look up to see if conspiracy theories are true. All of those are good. And importantly, they feel good, right? So policymakers that don't know how to get, white male elites to behave, they can raise money to set up a fact check database and feel like you're doing stuff, right? But this actually might be the wrong focus, because we know that, a lot of users, or actually the majority of users, don't believe fake news. They know it's fake. The Republican congressmen that are retweeting the election fraud, they know it's fake, but they're doing it to get ahead. They're doing it to get reelected. They're doing it to appease their base, right? So it's not the case that people are being tricked. They're using fake news in a different way. And generally, producers and spreaders of fake news, they're highly sophisticated, right? So these aren't, fact checks are not going to beat the people who are used to using social media to game the system. And we know this. So now if you look to see who's being prosecuted in the Capitol riots, these were not uneducated kind of hacks, right? These individuals were rich. They had planned ahead. They had coordinated. They had booked private planes, right, to get there. This was not an average, a person who got tricked and decided to show up to DC. These were folks who, don't care whether the truth is real, but they want an incentive to do something badly. They want kind of a motivation to do something bad. Okay, but so media literacy, we need to come at it from a different angle, and we can look at this from studies in marketing. So fake news is interdisciplinary. We need to learn from all over the place. And one great kind of marketing study had to do with media literacy and healthy eating, right? So the problem was that teenagers were falling for clever ads for junk food, right? So, chips and popcorn and soda and stuff. Teenagers would see an ad, they would immediately, say, oh, that Coca-Cola looks so refreshing, let me buy a Coca-Cola instead of a juice, right? And in high schools, and this is also in the US, in high schools, they have been enacting healthy eating campaigns, right? So this is trying to instruct high schoolers to eat well. It's important for your body, it's important for your mind, it's important for your long-term development, right? Problem is that the teenagers didn't care. They weren't listening, right? Teenagers are pretty myopic. They think they're going to live forever. They're like, I'll eat healthy when I'm 40 and boring and stuff, right? Okay, so the experiment knew this and decided to test different types of media literacy, right? So they split the teenagers into two groups for the experiment. The first group, received the, it's good for you, protect your body, long-term, benefits messaging. The second group learned two things. First, that food marketing is manipulative. So you didn't lecture the teenagers that what they were eating was bad. You showed them how Coca-Cola was tricking them into buying their product. And that this type of marketing, this type of trick is typically targeted towards vulnerable populations, right? And so you're trying to get low-income people to buy junk food. You're not trying to get kind of the wealthier subsets, right? So it's two different types of learning. One is just giving facts, and the other is teaching people how to play the game, right? And sure enough, the second group was much less likely to buy junk food. They completely changed their eating habits. And what was interesting is that this worked really well on teens, because the current generation, right, the generation like the end of the millennials, the new generation, they have a senses of fairness and justice. So they're, these are the folks who are really aware of inequality. They don't like inequality. These are also the folks who grew up with the internet, right? So they're much more savvy than we are, but they did not respond very positively to the idea that commercials are not just innocuous information, they're trying to trick you, right? And so by teaching individuals a new type of media literacy, teaching them how the system worked, they were much more likely to change their behavior than just kind of normative, please eat carrots, don't eat soda, right? And so generally in media literacy, we need to rethink, because what we know about fake news is that all of our problems right now are rooted in identity politics, social identity, political identity. It's no longer what tax reform do you want. This is, I'm a member of this party, which, stands for this type of family values, this thing on gun rights, only the people in my church are in this party. All of these different dimensions of our identity, which used to map across political options and choices, right? If you were religious, you could find religious people in both the Democrats, in both the Republicans, right? Or if you were a gun owner, maybe you didn't agree with the Democrats' policy on guns, but them wanting to regulate something was not a personal attack on you. And now when identity politics gets stuck and fused with real politics, then everything triggers our fight or flight response, right? Me saying I don't want gun regulation turns into me saying I am judging your identity, your way of life, you are the enemy, right? And again, back to the role of elites. Elites help foster this because elites want to get elected. So it's much easier to invoke fear. They will threaten your identity, they will threaten your church groups, than it is to try to argue that one healthcare policy will be more effective than the other, right? So as long as we're into identity politics, it's really difficult to talk to each other. It's really difficult to listen to each other. And political parties are exacerbating this trend. Also, if you think that information comes from the other, comes from an opposition that's trying to get you, that's trying to threaten your way of life, you will treat any and all information as suspicious. Right? So it's much easier to fall for that's fake news from, an opposition party that's been made out to be a bad guy, been made out to be evil, has been made out to be the other, you separate from them, right? And so identity politics is driving all of this. And we need to think about that when it comes to media literacy, right? It's much more effective to tell someone, okay, we don't necessarily disagree, but look how these politicians are trying to get us to disagree. They're trying to make it about identity when really it's just about, whether we want to build a bridge. Telling folks that is much more effective than trying to convince them that Trump is evil, right? Because there are plenty of reasons why folks voted for Republicans, voted for Trump, voted for Democratic candidates, but just starting with the fact that you're wrong doesn't make anyone want to listen to you, right? Okay, and also what we know, so there's been a lot of work in the past couple of years about how to fix this, right? How to rebuild the links, how to get over identity politics. And inequality and grievances have a lot to do with it, right? So if you're in a minority group that has never been treated well by the government, you are angry and you want to find a place for that anger. Fake news is built into that, right? Folks can use fake news to reinforce your existing beliefs and then try to get you aligned with one party. So it's fake news is one kind of drip in the bucket of larger issues in the society. So one thing that actually the new president is doing a very good job at is all of these executive orders are actually designed to start getting rid of structural inequality, representation failures, and grievances, right? If you start fixing fundamental problems in society, fake news doesn't have as much fuel. That's not to say that's not a problem. All this will take a long time to fix, but the types of media literacy we need to be teaching have more to do with kind of the history of racism in the United States and structural inequalities than, here's a fact-checking database. Anytime you doubt, go to this website. That's not gonna do anything. And finally, how do you change minds? You don't start by yelling at random people. You start with your immediate family, which can sometimes be really tough, right? Especially if your family believes in this political and social identity, believes that, these distinctions are really important, and think that if you're trying to talk about politics, you're insulting them, right? However, you are much more likely to convince your mother, daughter, aunt, niece, neighbor that maybe they should rethink their behavior, or to tell them about, all the things that I've talked about in this thing. Because, we trust each other. We take cues from, folks we know. You're much more likely to listen to your neighbor's recommendation for what physician to try than maybe the internet's, right? So it's really kind of local context. And I'll put this on the slides. I won't read all of this, but this tweet thread, so Dana Young is a professor. She focuses on psychology. She's been doing a lot on identity politics. And I love this tweet thread because she says, okay, interpersonal relationships are really the key here. And before you yell at me, you shouldn't have to do this. You know, she's like, well, too bad, right? If you want relationships with your family who are Trump supporters, this is the only way to do it, right? You cannot say, and she gives the example of, imagine a parent who doesn't want to get vaccinated because they believe all sorts of crazy stuff about the vaccine, right? You can do it in two ways. You can say, don't be stupid. Everyone knows vaccines can work, which is not going to help persuade them to your case, right? That's an attack on them. That's an attack on their intelligence, right? But she gives an alternative way to do it, which is, I understand your concerns. The world is upside down. It's hard to know who to trust. It's your decision. I respect you. But I would hate to see you unable to participate in your favorite activities or unable to see your friends because you don't get vaccinated, right? It's tough. It's really, really tough, especially when you think that there is an obvious truth that folks aren't seeing. But the reason they're not seeing this obvious truth has to do with the amount of fake news in the pipeline, identity politics, and the fact that elites are telling them something totally different. And so it's understandable why folks would get confused. And also everyone's been stuck indoors for a year. People are just angry and sad for a lot of other different reasons, right? And so anyway, so the tweet thread goes on. So you're more than welcome to kind of read it on your own time. But just to end, so, you know, fake news is increasingly a problem. We need to be aware that it's a problem. The producers and conspiracy theorists and stuff are a small part of the larger picture. So unless we can get elites to stop amplifying the message and endorsing these types of messages, this will be a very dangerous problem, actually. And also, unless we can get people to understand more about the media ecosystem and more about how to relate to others, it will also continue to be a serious problem. Now, like, the good news is that there have been some steps to regulate. There's been deplatforming. Interestingly enough, I spent a lot of this week talking to the Associated Press about they've now charged an individual, a Twitter user, for their tweets on Twitter. So this was a user that since 2016 has been peddling kind of electoral fraud and was telling people on Twitter to vote by text, which obviously is, you know, a violation. But they're prosecuting this individual for stuff they said on social media for an electoral fraud charge on the ground, right? Mm-hmm. Now, this just happened yesterday. So we're in a whole new world because if individuals, I mean, Trump's tweets have been used in legal cases before, but if individuals can be prosecuted for what they say on Twitter, it's not just an anonymous platform. It's not just something you say. It's not just this imaginary, who cares? It was Twitter. It didn't count until it did. So that could set an important precedent, but it also opens up a whole bunch of other legal issues, right? So what is opinion? What is fact? You know, to what extent do people know this? That, I mean, it was public, right? Twitter is public, but this won't help private platforms like Parler. Anyway, so happy to talk about all that and more. I'll go ahead and stop sharing and open it to Q&A, but that was my brief recap on all the crazy things that have been going on since I came to you last. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Allie. That was great. I think since we're a small enough group, we can just unmute and ask a question as it comes to you. And, you know, we'll try and keep it to a half hour or so, probably. Okay, so.
And do you want me to call on folks or do you want to do it, Liz?
If they want to just, you know, speak up is fine. I think because there's only 8 other attendees besides you and me. So I don't know that we really need to do calling on.
Well, then I have a question.
Go ahead.
Help me appreciate, my reaction at an early point was, whoa, when did this definition of elites catch hold? That whole prism was new for me. I mean, using the term like that, and it used to used to just be people you dismissed if you didn't want to talk about. I mean, can you help me with that a little bit? And so that I understand how potent it is now or how common it is now, or?
Yeah, and so elites is it's an academic term, but it's also used kind of in Washington, right? And an elite is anyone who has a position of power and typically a relatively large audience, right? But this, if you think about sociology, the elite is a generic catchholder phrase. So a church leader could be an elite, right? Like local elites are pillars in the community, typically the organizing nodes of society. So a mayor would be an elected local elite. A church leader would be, or the local organizer of the Democrats abroad could be considered to be a local elite, right? And the reason why we kind of think about society as like a network is because politicians and just society, you focus on these nodes. You focus on elites to mobilize voters, right? You focus on elites to help translate what's going on at different levels, right? Because they're kind of central nodes, right? And so it matters less kind of who you define as an elite. You pretty much know it when you see it, right? So, and in the social media ecosystem, it'd be the difference between, Joe Schmo, who's a user on Twitter who has 10 followers and, follows a couple politicians and every once in a while tweets at them, versus having someone like Trump who has millions and millions and millions of followers. So if he tweets something about fake news, a huge proportion of the world will see it, while Joe Schmo tweets a fake news. We're not worried about him changing the minds, while we are worried about kind of elites. Also, what we know from other, before fake news existed, we talked about kind of elite cues in voting, right? So voters are myopic. We have dogs and lives and families and jobs, and it is not necessarily our responsibility to go through all the different types of healthcare policy there is. That's why we elect politicians to specialize, right? So politicians specialize. They are the ones where their interns, their legislative staffs, them in committees, they figure out whether Obamacare is better. They negotiate this. And then they're supposed to tell us what's going on in a way that we can understand. And this is completely fine. This is democracy, right? Every individual in a democratic system doesn't have time to invest in this information. So we outsource it and then expect elites to in turn tell us why they supported a policy, tell us why it will be good for us. And then, I can use that information to vote, right? So elites have always, or political elites, elected officials in particular, although you could say, head of civil services provide the same thing. Like we depend on the CDC to tell us which masks are important. We have no idea, right? We don't know. So we're used to this information transmission. We're used to, obviously elites sometimes bend the truth. Obviously elites are strategic. I mean, they're not perfect, right? But we're used to listening to elites. And so this kind of pathway was already set up. And so when elites started to lie or elites started to push fake news, we're used to listening to them and believing them. And so that's why a lot of people did, through no fault of their own. Like we're used to being able to trust that what the president says is true. We might not have all the information, right? The president is more informed than we are. But that's one of the big issues, is that we live in systems where we're used to elites telling the truth. We're used to updating our behavior. If the Republican Party says, oh, the election was rigged, we have not been in a system where folks are used to, like doubting that, right? And so elites have a platform, they have range, and we're in a society where we're used to being able to trust elites. So when they go off the rails, it's really confusing to the average voter, right? Because, they spent 50 years of their life more or less trusting politicians, and now politicians are inventing crazy, crazy things. So they just don't know what to do. And a lot of time it actually paralyzes people. They don't know what to do, so then they don't vote, or they don't engage, or they just go to their heuristics. So political parties are heuristics, right? Most of us don't know all of the individual platforms of either the Republican or the Democratic Party. Though note, the Republican Party had no platform in 2006, which is another massive Democratic failure that just got lost in like the sea of craziness that was 2020, right? But we don't know all the individual platforms, so we use heuristics. You're like, well, I like the Democrats, I'm a Democrat. I don't know what's going on, but if I know you're a Democrat, I probably know we share relatively liberal social values and, less conservative economic values, right? It's a shortcut. We use shortcuts all the time. And so elites are banking on the fact that you might not know what's going on, but you know and like the Republicans, so you'll just follow them off a cliff, right?
Penelope made a couple of comments in the chat.
I don't even have the chat up, sorry.
That's no problem. So she said, how does one stop the elites from talking fake news? And later,
if I can intervene here, that
Okay.
was just repeating what was being said.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to understand it. And I have
Okay.
2 comments. One, democracy is not a television program where you passively watch things happening. It now is. I accept that it now is. And the second thing is, I don't know how to understand the idea of giving permission to, the Republican Party has been in the business since Ronald Reagan of giving permission to lies. That's, in my opinion, what their platform has been. The Democratic Party has never had an answer. So I wonder if the Democratic Party can have an answer. It's an elite. It doesn't tell the truth 100% of the times. It makes a lot of mistakes, and it has a lot of idiots in office. That's been true since Reagan.
Yeah.
The last decent human being who's president was the one before Reagan. So it's very interesting, but I don't see how it gets at organizing and challenging the Democratic Party. That's why I'm a member, to challenge this stuff in the places that it can do so. I'm sorry if I'm talking too much, but I feel passionately about this stuff.
No, and those are both 2 good questions / comments, right? So I'm going to separate them out a little bit, because there's one that has to do with the arts of kind of lies and propaganda and to what extent it is a part of a democratic system. And there's also what the Democrats need to do, right? And they're related, right? But I'm going to separate them out. So lying is a strategy. It's always been a strategy. And propaganda, even though, especially in the US audiences, propaganda is seen as this very negative thing, right? You think about North Korea, you think about China, you think about, non-democratic propaganda is effectively lies. But we consider propaganda, the baseline definition has to do with the fact that in all types of anything, whether autocracies, democracies, any type of kind of government, right? One party tends to advocate, they say the things that they did well and they ignore the things that they did badly, right? They selectively highlight and they present information in a partisan way, right? Now, this is not necessarily bad, or this is just a fact of life, right? Just like there are despicable politicians, there are politicians that lie on both, in both parties in the United States and also in Europe, right? So, we've seen the rise of all sorts of parties in Europe and all sorts of individual politicians. They get elected even though they're lying, right? I think what's changed is it's now, and this has to do kind of with the Trump effect, it's now that even if there were kind of bad apples, overall the system on average tended to punish folks who lied, right? If you lied, it would be all over the papers. This would then incentivize the rise of good challengers, right? And you could say, you promised to do this, or you stole a bunch of taxpayer money. I'm not going to elect you anymore. And so voters would be able to use the media as a source of trusted information, use the parties recognizing that it's not good to have a candidate, so having the parties encouraging lying candidates to stay down. There were basically consequences for, lying in public. We had I always tell this story, Liz, but our individual representative from Peoria, Illinois, Aaron Schock.
Aaron Schock.
got taken out of office because he spent his taxpayer money on decorating his congressional office like Downton Abbey. Okay, so he literally embezzled money to decorate his office with red walls and all sorts of strange gilt frames. And it only came to light because a journalist was in his office and an aide said, oh yeah, that was part of the new redecorating. We're not supposed to tell anyone. And then the journalist kind of capitalized on it. Then it turns out, you know, if you embezzle something for something so obvious as your office, you're clearly doing it in other places too. Like you're not slick at all. And so he was ejected from the party and kind of lost his seat, right? But no, they're lying politicians all the time. But there used to be at least a baseline understanding that you couldn't lie and get along or get very far in politics because democracy would keep turning. It would bring up challengers and then voters would kind of vote people out. Nowadays, voters, you know, there are lots of reasons voters are uninformed, voters don't care. Some countries like France, your personal life is your personal life, right? So, you know, what you do, the affairs you have, you know, there are cultural differences. That would not bar you from office, while in other conservative kind of countries it would. So lying is a strategy, it's always existing. Nowadays, it's with the idea that fake news, you can call anything you don't like fake news, and the fact that voters are kind of confused. So one of the reasons why I showed the chart earlier that had to do with trust in media is because we rely, when politicians lie or spin, we rely on an external source to tell us what's going on because the parties have the incentives. They want to win office too, so they might not crack down. If we're in a context where everyone is saying that there's fake news out there, you and I are going to say, okay, I'm not sure where it is, but I know it's there. I don't trust anyone. Let me wait and try and figure this out, right? And this is part of an autocrat's playbook. So in almost every kind of democratic backsliding we see, what does the autocrat do? You get rid of the media because the media helps voters become more, without this information, voters get paralyzed. They stop, they wait because they're not sure what the truth is. And by the time they wait, the autocrat has dismantled the judiciary, it's dismantled Congress, it's dismantled. That's not the case in the US, but that's in other cases, right?
No.
And now we're seeing that actually in the United States. Okay, so that's kind of the first answer. Now, what do the Democrats do, right? Now we're in a context where politicians have lied and not been punished, partially because voters are confused, partially because some voters have decided to give up on democracy, right? That's just a fact. Like they know stuff is fake. They want to be in power. They want to be able to have truck rallies and feel good about themselves. They're low status individuals who have, you know, who likes hating on other individuals, right? Like that's just a large proportion of the Republican base we now know is like 13% actually is like that, right? So Democrats have always not played dirty, right? So you know, the Republicans ram through Supreme Court nominations right before elections, but then say that there's not enough time to do an impeachment trial, right? Republicans play dirty while calling themselves the party of law and order. And Democrats are in the tough position because, you know, Democrats, Michelle Obama, when they go low, we go high, right? Democrats are also, I think, too conservative sometimes in that, you know, they don't want, or they hope that they can persuade Republicans, but with polarization, this is becoming increasingly hard to do in the legislature. Voters are not polarized, but in Congress, the people are further apart from each other than they ever were. However, Democrats are stuck because if you start to cheat, if you start to ignore kind of the fundamental rules of democracy, right, this breaks norms. Now, Trump broke all sorts of norms, and we are going to be paying for his breaking of these norms for years, right? The Senate has broken all sorts of norms. Like McConnell actually is going to be, the history books will cite McConnell as the damage done to democracy in addition to saying Trump. But it's really tough because if the Democrats play dirty, they undermine the very norms that keep democracy together, right? And they set a precedent that is bad for the survival, right? So what Democrats need to do is to convince voters, again, that they need to be the party of democracy, that voter enfranchisement is a nonpartisan issue, right? That other things like healthcare should be a nonpartisan issue. And it's really, really tough, except, you know, on the ground organizing. So again, back to elites and community networks, Georgia was flipped because they spent over a year contacting all the different groups. And the DNC was keeping track of this on Facebook, right? So the DNC is now like, hey, there's this really cool knitter society in Kansas. Why don't you go talk to the leader of the knitter society, ask what they need, ask what their policy priorities are. And, these little kind of 100 groups at a time, if the Knitter Society is then sharing Democratic picnics and organizing and get out the vote, knitters talk to the crocheters talk to the mums groups, spread. Like, you can do a lot bottom up, while honestly, the average voter, talking about how bad Trump is, that's not a narrative that really resonates with people, while talking to the mums about how, like, the bridge to the daycare has been washed out for the last 10 years, and their commute is longer. That's how you get the moms out to vote, not talking about normative, Trump is evil and is going to destroy democratic ideals, because most people care about, whether they can feed their family, not necessarily whether we've eroded, the Constitution that was set up by the founding fathers. Founding fathers also lied like crazy, by the way. I teach Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin made stuff up all the time. It's nothing. But that's what the Democrats need to do. So local organizing, and also giving money. Sorry, now I'm on a little bit of a rant, but giving money to state level organizations, not candidates. You fund McGrath, the $5 million McGrath has is really hard to redistribute, right? $500 million that, the Democratic Party of Kentucky has, that institution stays. Candidates come and go, right? But because of our stupid campaign finance system, we're incentivized to give to candidates. But Democrats, not that they should start playing dirty, but they should realize that the Republicans are going to keep playing dirty, and the Republicans are now a party against democracy. So, don't work with the ones you think you can work with, but you're never going to change the mind of a Madison Cawthorn, for example, right? That's just not going to happen. Also, the chat's like blowing up. Sorry.
That's okay. I was just going to point out that a few minutes ago, Lisa Berger, she's having camera issues. She says, you said Twitter is public in contrast to Parler, which is private. Could you explain that? I thought they were both private companies.
Sorry, that was I should have been more precise. So both are private for-profit companies, which means, our ability to regulate them is tough. And their users are bound by their terms and conditions, right? So the reason why Facebook, Twitter, Parler is doing no monitoring, which is why they would be in the same if they were. They can only kind of deplatform people if they're violating their terms, which is like, hate speech, all of that stuff, right? So that's the mechanism by which folks are being taken off. It has nothing to do with free speech or any normative type of, whatever. So that's the status of the social media companies, the legal status of the social media companies. The information that users present on Twitter is public, although you can lock your account so no one sees it, right? While Parler is completely private. So our ability to access all of the conversations, to monitor all of the conversations on Parler is much more difficult because it's private. While Twitter, if you post something publicly on Twitter, because of the terms and conditions that you sign, it is public. Anyone can access it, anyone can read it. I, as an academic, can use it, right? I can collect it as data because it's what you said, because you made it public, you signed up to a terms and conditions that said this data would be shared throughout the world, right? One of the things that academics struggle with, and also kind of the DNC and other organizations, is that you want to know what these right-wing groups are doing, but they won't let you in. So, is it ethical to pretend to be a Trump supporter, to join a Parler group to see what they're up to? Now, if you're the FBI or CIA or something, I suspect they are allowed to do that. But I, as an academic, that would be considered kind of unethical against the code of ethics, right? So all we can do is study data from folks who have unwittingly made their stuff public, which is actually a lot. You'd be surprised. Like, most of these Stop the Steal groups, they either don't care or they're not savvy enough to realize that, they delete tweets. Or I, in particular, have family in Illinois, one who is a policeman and who is very pro Blue Lives Matter right now, in the radicalized kind of way, not in the, we want to give police help too kind of way. And he flipped his name backwards and then started tweeting stuff, not realizing that the rest of his like posts are still public, so you can go back a couple months and figure out what he said. His network is intact. They think that they're hiding, but they're not, right? But anyway, so the public data that the platforms express and that we can use to understand more about this groups, that's one issue, the public-private, like what can we know versus the the private status of these social media companies. If there was a public federal internet platform, like this would probably be fixed by now, right? But we rely on advertisers to threaten to pull their stuff from Facebook. That's how you get Mark Zuckerberg to take action, right? Or you have users quit the platform because it's a product. They're selling us a product. They're not selling us democracy.
We're the product, though.
I have a question that I've been raising my hand, but I'd like to ask it if I may. It's kind of critical, Alexandra, so bear with me, because I found your presentation very informative. I'm not a social media user at all. Okay, I get my information from CNN and from the New York Times.
Yep, you get it from the television, right? Yeah.
Yeah, mostly, but I
Or
read
the
the New
paper.
York Times every day as well.
Yeah.
And what I heard in your presentation, and because of the way you've been presented to us, of course, I trust you. So this is everything that you say, I will trust, except at a certain point, I didn't trust it anymore. And I wanted to share with you why. And that was when you were talking about the people who were involved in the insurrection. You said a couple of things that sounded to me very unscientific and somewhat biased. And I'd like to understand them better. You said that they were probably very rich and very well educated. The very rich part, because of some private planes that might have been hired, could have been paid for by somebody else, right? We don't know who paid for that insurrection yet. So I think that's something we could find out about. But the very well educated was not my impression from the interviews of people that we saw on TV. And the reason I bring this up is that because we could believe you and we could say, oh, so they all knew what they were doing. But I had the impression that these people really were convinced that the election had been stolen from them, that there was a passion there about that, which was beyond disinformation. They were buying the disinformation. They had swallowed it whole. And I'm troubled by that, because I think just dismissing them as rich or well-educated doesn't do it for me, doesn't help me really understand them. So that's why I'm asking my question. I wonder if you have some ideas about this that go a little deeper, or that you think that this is still a work in progress before we really know who these people were and who organized and who brought them together, if they were brought together.
Yeah. And so, okay, so what we're doing right now, and I say we as kind of a larger academics and also FBI prosecutors and journalists, right? Trying to figure out what the population of people were who went to the Capitol, right? And there's a lot of interesting things going on in crowdsourcing. So a lot of the identities of these individuals have been discovered because their family members have turned them in, right? Their family members have said, this is my mother. This is my crazy uncle. This is my ex-boyfriend, from high school, right? And I guess so. What I was trying to, or the point I was trying to make earlier in the presentation is that there were independently wealthy individuals that participated in the Capitol riots, right? There were also other types of individuals, and sorry if that wasn't clear. So there's a diverse group connected by a series of motivations too, right? I think there are some individuals, and you can see this with kind of the collapse of QAnon. So QAnon is the conspiracy theorist that thought that the world would be, there's this master plan for the world and Q would come and kick out Biden. There are some folks who actually believe that, and they thought that by, attacking the Capitol, they were helping this to be, real. I mean, it's a cult, right? But the believers, right? So we know that there were some there, but we also know that there were, and again, so there were a couple examples of folks that they've identified by name. There's a realtor who lives in a mansion, right? She, was invited, right? She says she was invited on this private plane, but either way, she would be considered to be affluent, independent source of wealth. So that's how we know one of them. A couple others, were chartered, right? So elites in these networks paid for buses to bring people along. So that's another type of group. And they were funded by, kind of super PACs, right? So that's another group. And the one thing that we haven't, so we have kind of the subsample of folks you've identified. There's some folks that are still out there, right? Because if you were successfully masked and you didn't show up on the social media videos, it is going to be tough for the FBI to kind of track those people down much more than the folks that were live streaming that they were at the Capitol using their personal Twitter account. Like those folks have already been nabbed, right? But a good proportion of those middle people were from out of state, right? So they chose to come and drive or fly or do whatever to the US. So this is different than what we would think, oh, some Trump supporters happen to be in DC, they saw a party going on, they were kind of opportunistic, right? And then overwhelmingly, these individuals are college educated, right? Now, that doesn't mean that necessarily, sorry?
No,
yeah,
so they're translating.
Yeah, so they're college educated. That doesn't mean that they can't fall prey to conspiracies. That doesn't mean that, they did anything while they were in school. This is the problem of using just like college degree, right? It varies, right? And this is one of the things that folks are grappling with, because you really think it's going to be kind of low income, high school graduates only to fall for Trump's rhetoric, the MAGA lifestyle, et cetera. But there are, white college age Republicans make up a substantial portion of the MAGA supporters, right? And in fact, the more educated the Republicans get, the less likely they are to believe in all sorts of stuff, right? Which is, I think I showed this the last time I was there, where that's the scariest thing. So Democrats, the more educated you are, the less likely you are to fall for fake news, the less likely you are to support all of the kind of crazy things, the more likely you are to value the media. Republicans, you have this opposite effect, where high school educated Republicans are sometimes more likely to believe in the media and to, not believe in Trump than educated Republicans are. And now it's an open question, but I think a lot of them realize that, the election wasn't stolen, but they want to be in power. This seems to be a useful complaint. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, to what extent some people have actually thought about this. It's unclear, and we don't know, because we have to survey them. We have to ask them, and are you gonna, like, I don't think Ted Cruz thinks the election was stolen. Ted Cruz is doing this to capture Trump's base to set him up for a presidential run in 2024, right? I literally believe that. But you will never get him to say, this is bullshit. I'm doing this to become elected. Like, most of the time, you will never get politicians to say. So in any case, you're right in that it's a mixed group. We also are still trying to understand who organized it. Were these supporters? What is the type of person that just gets up? And now, coming back, so now many of them have been arrested. Many of them are now facing, sedition charges, all sorts of things. They're crying, oh, I didn't know this would happen. Like, oh, it was a spontaneous thing. I got caught up in the moment. But they're from Ohio, right? You cannot get caught up in the moment if you had to drive 10 hours to DC to make this happen, right? And so, FBI prosecutors are like, nope, it's not spontaneous, right? And so it's really interesting. But hopefully we'll have more insight into, because this is only the tip of the iceberg, because these are just the folks.
I agree.
There are plenty of people who would attack a state capitol before they would ever attack so these would be the extremists.
I find a bit of a double standard there. I mean, 4 years ago when we had the March on Washington and the Pussy Hats, plenty of people I knew drove 8 states across the US to march on Washington. It was peaceful protest. And I grew up in Texas, and I know people who drove to DC for January 6th. To my knowledge, they did not actually break into the Capitol, but there was a rally there separately. And I mean, I get the feeling, these people, I agree with you completely about Ted Cruz. He wants to run for president in 2024, and he's going to manipulate it. But I do get the feeling that some of these people are true believers in this to some extent. The people that I know that went to my high school are, they're not necessarily poor and uneducated, but neither are they elites with a lot of followers. Most of them are sort of average middle class people. There's a lot in between. And how much, Trump had 70 million people vote for him. And I mean, some of them just held their nose and did it because they're always Republicans or because they wanted lower taxes. But there's a certain percentage that I think has fallen for at least some of this fake news. Have there been any studies to try to break down the Trump voters and see how many are influenced by that? Because I think it's too simple to say, oh, they don't believe it. Some do. There are people being influenced, and they're not all necessarily bad people, but an influencer has to have someone to influence, and there are people following.
Yeah, and there's was there a two finger from
No,
Germany?
I have a follow-up question, Doctor, when you finish with this. My question's connected. Hi.
Okay, great. Okay, so you're next. Okay, so this actually gets to be really interesting because, yeah, so we don't want to over generalize because just in both parties, there are different types of people, right? So there's a variety, and it's really interesting because it's no longer the traditional cleavages in society no longer map onto the party structure, right? So it's not necessarily the case that everyone who's working class will go Democratic, right? It's not necessarily the case that every businessman person will go Republican, right? And so we're still trying to figure this out because it also shifts. Now what we're trying to do is figure out, of the Republican Party, there are definitely folks who were lifelong Republicans who didn't like Trump, but either didn't know the extent to which he would damage the country, right? Thought he was a good businessman, didn't like politics as normal. Like, they fell for his appeals. His appeals were very effective, right? So some of them or the Democrats have gotten so far from their preferences, they don't like Trump, but they would rather do anything than vote for a Democrat. And you can see this in the data from down ballot races, right? So typically when we're looking at party voting, you have the president, and then you have a whole bunch of other, sometimes it's your Senate or congressperson, sometimes it's your local whatever, your mayor, the attorney general. If you split, so if you vote one way on the presidential election and you vote a different way, you vote for a different party on the down ballot races, a lot of times that shows that there's something weird going on, that you're not just voting on your party identity, right? And there were plenty of Republicans who voted for Biden and then the rest was down ballot, right? Which shows that these would have been the Republicans that finally broke, right? So the past 4 years, Trump was too much. And we also suspect that facing a non-Trump candidate in the midterms and in the next presidential elections, those folks will go back to Republicans. So Georgia is not a foregone conclusion, right? Other states are not a foregone conclusion because we cannot count on someone who votes down ballot Republican but voted against Trump to consistently be a centrist, maybe a blue dog, without potentially appealing to them with policy, right? It's not going to happen unless we do stuff. They've done surveys now of who, because thinking about the new Trump party that Trump's supposed to create, if that happens, that would be great, actually, because in a majoritarian system, you know what that does? That splits the vote. So I think we should do electoral reform and go to PR like every other sane country, European country in the world, but that's going to be very difficult to do. But in any case, in trying to assess the extent to which there are Trump Republicans versus normal Republicans,
right? Yeah,
it's about 13%, 13 to 17%, depending on which survey, identify themselves as a Trump Republican. So that is a substantial wing, but that is not everyone, right? And that shows that there are many more Republicans that just valued power. So you're like, well, Trump is saying a lot of bad things, but gosh, if I let someone else be in charge of the legislature, they're going to raise taxes on my business, or they're going to take away my gun rights, or, it's perfectly rational for individuals to do that. It's weighing it's weighing preferences. And especially if you have a party saying, no, we are we are pro-democracy, they're just lying. It's easier for voters to make that choice where you're like, well, I don't really like Trump, but I'm worried and I'd rather not have Democrat. This seems to be bad, but I want to stay in power because not being in power is really bad. Okay, we'll vote for Trump. Like, there are a lot of folks in the middle, and this has nothing to do with necessarily about being educated or not being, this is just the strategic, choice that voters make. But it's about 13 to 70% would be called actual Trumpers. And then also on the, I do believe, and what's interesting is that there are plenty of folks who went to DC just wanting to protest. There is a good chance that some of those folks went to the rally and then, you know, made choices that they wouldn't have, that they didn't come to DC with the intention
Exactly. Yeah.
of storming the Capitol, for sure. I think that's for sure. But I think it would be a mistake to assume that that is the modal tendency, because we know that a lot of the January 6th attack was pre-coordinated, including there were tours given at the Capitol by some of the new congressmen, by folks who later passed on that information so the attack would be successful. This was done on a large scale in a very kind of scary way. But no, I'm sure that there were folks who thought that they were protesting, and then, I don't know, there were also probably folks who thought, wow, this is crazy. Like, as long as I don't do anything, as long as I just wander in, I could say I thought it was open. Of course, right? Human nature. There are some people who probably wandered in just thinking this is crazy, I'll never get a chance to do this, but not wanting to kill Pelosi.
Yeah, I mean, and I definitely agree that there were people coordinating. There was also, I think, someone on the inside, because you couldn't have gotten past all that security so easily without some help from within the Capitol.
The Capitol
But
Guard.
I just think we have to be kind of careful and not paint everyone with the same brush, because there are people who are manipulating it for their own benefit, but there are people who are falling for it as well, for whatever their reasons are. They find this rhetoric appealing, and they are maybe being manipulated rather than manipulating. And I think we can't lose that distinction. So.
Yeah, and it's tough too, especially, and journalists are struggling with this, because, you know, you want to paint all sides of the story, but it's also very easy to use that, oh, folks didn't know, or like, oh, it's peaceful or something, to excuse others. And so I think you've probably seen this in the coverage of the Capitol, is the reason why we're focusing more on the planning and more on, is because we don't want to lose that narrative, because it's very easy to be like, oh, this wasn't, like, it wasn't an insurrection, it was just, no. Like, maybe there were some folks who were along for the ride, but like, all the best evidence that we had was this was a riot. Folks need to be held accountable for riots, because that was the thing that we've not done very well. I mean, we should have clamped down, should have, done arrest warrants. Every Republican should have spoken out against that. Like, this was basically a trial run. Most likely we will have more riots in the future, because the fallout from this one was not strong enough. Also, the US has actually been downgraded, the riot plus the response, because countries can have riots, respond harshly to them, and survive as democracies. Those two, we are now downgraded as a democracy in every political science database measuring democracies. It is that bad, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's really, and it's very disturbing, and they got away with it in a large part because they're white. If you see how much of a police and a military presence were at the peaceful Black Lives Matters protests in the summer, and then you have a bunch of white people and no one seems to care. So, I mean, there are a lot of problems in there, but I just think it's not all people manipulating. There are also people being manipulated. And the question is, how do you reach those people? Is there a way to bring them back to maybe, I mean, you won't convert them to being Democrats, but to maybe thinking more critically about the news. And that's what I don't know,
Some of that is going to, so folks who are, let's say, like, easily influenceable, just because, they don't want to engage in politics, or they like the social aspect of, like, they liked the church group MAGA. Like, MAGA is fun. You get to wear the same clothing and drive around, with flags on your trucks. I mean, citizens like to hang out together. And I don't know, even Ithaca is a super liberal city that managed to elect a Republican representative who, I don't know, I spent a lot of my time like tweeting at him, right? And like calling him. But it's crazy. And like, when we think about, so we know the local politicians actually in Ithaca, because we do debates with them and stuff. And they're just like, there's no ground game here. Like, there's no, like, Republicans do fun things to get people together. Democrats are like, well, you're liberal, of course you should vote Democrats. There are no pizza parties. And this was before COVID, right? So this was, over the past couple of years and stuff. And so strangely enough, some folks just want to be in a group, and especially if you are low status. So this is another, I won't get into this too much, but a lot of the folks that Trump is appealing to are individuals who are doing fine, but not as well as their parents. They, aren't unskilled, but, they're not in positions of power. They don't necessarily have status in society, and they used to. So just by the color of their skin, or their gender. They used to be well respected. They used to be able to hold positions. They used to get a whole lot of stuff without doing work. And now that is changing, right? Demographic shifts are making it such that, you know, they're kind of plateauing and sinking while other groups in society are rising. And they're super mad about that, right? And so this type of, you know, hate anyone rhetoric, empty, because there's no policy. Trump has no policy, right? It's social club plus, you know, if you feel like you've been screwed over, let's come together and let's hate someone else. Like it's a tale as old as time, right? So a lot of these, and this is why kind of the structural inequality is going to be so important to fix, because those folks, some of them will always be Trumpers, but there are plenty of people where if Trump didn't exist and if the Republican Party gave them policies, gave them things to do, engaged them, listened to them, right? They would most likely go back, right? They would find a different outlet. And so that's why squishing Trump is so important, because as long as that exists, folks who are kind of in the middle, or folks who are lower status, or folks who are frustrated with society, it just is a shiny light. They're like moths to the flame. But if you get rid of that light, then if they want to participate in politics, they have to go through, you know, other channels. And so, but it's tough. Like there's no solution. And also it's going to depend on local level contextual conditions. Texas is not like Pennsylvania, and we should stop pretending that it is. Sorry, Katie, that was I know you raised your hand ages ago. So go ahead.
I don't know if I'm the next in line. There might be.
You
someone
are.
else.
You're the
I am.
next one, Katie.
All right. Well, first of all, Alexandra or Dr. Cirone, I'm looking at your name there. Thank you. This was really fascinating. I'm sorry that I came in late. I look forward, I've already checked with Liz, to watching the recording and looking at your slides again. I'm going to make two short asides. One is, as I put in the box, you know, here we are, a lot of white people on this call, it looks like to me. We're not talking about racism, why people were there at the Capitol, and it was a factor. Second, I would say, and these are just asides, I can't help it. You just noted that we got such low marks for our response. There's another way to look at this. Our institutions are holding. Those guys were 6 hours later back in the room, certifying the votes. Biden got inaugurated. Cabinet secretaries are being approved. Work is happening. Police are investigating the insurrectionists and the police. People are being held accountable. So we're getting some points for all of this too around the world, that we are responding to it, and normalcy is coming back to America, you know, huge relief. But those are both the sides. My question is, when I came on the call, one of your slides or you was talking about the people that are believing the fake news, that need the fact checking, are exactly the people that will not check the facts. And they're exactly the people that when you even give them the facts, which you know, that are contrary to what they believe, they won't accept them. So it's really this cherry picking of facts. It's this you know, absolute refusal to look for facts that don't agree with your opinion already. So what do? How do we get the people that need new facts to respond in a rational way instead of the emotional way that they're responding? And I think maybe you said it already when you answered Susan's question. And in my mind, is it that it has to be not just policy, it has to be action. There have to be things in the next 2 years that Biden and his team can do that actually help those people that are believing the fake news, and help them in a very personal way. And then maybe they can be budged. But are there other ways that we can budge them? Thank you.
Yeah, so lots of good points. And it is true. So the institution's held. And so then you get into this, well, it could have been worse, but also it could have been better, right? And it's more, and it will also see kind of what happens, you know, it's not over, right? So this was, you know, a couple of weeks ago. The one thing I know political scientists were concerned that Republicans are still, because there was a critical point where if Republicans want to get rid of Trump, there is a common goal, right? You convict, you know, you don't need that many Republicans, right? So I think we need probably, I think 5 voted against, or 5 voted to proceed kind of with the impeachment trial, right? So you need more, you need the supra majority, right? You need 17 total. But there could be Republicans who say, that was the last straw. So if in the next kind of coming weeks, if there's, or at the trial, if there's information that said that Trump, told the guard to stand down, like even all of the Republican bases, that would be very, very difficult to stand down against, although some Republicans are trying, right? But I think political scientists were waiting to see, after such a momentous and clear event, like there's no Ukrainian dealings where we're not sure what's happening. Like if Trump helped, if Trump told this guard to stand down, or Trump was talking to folks and it helped, with the tours, and like there's enough evidence where you could get rid of him forever, right? So convict, he can't run again. The brand is done. Then the rest of the Republicans in the wing, you might have Trump-esque politicians, but but Republicans aren't doing that. And so that's what we're worried about, because now Republicans are doubling down on election fraud, and already the state legislatures have started to pass disenfranchisement votes. And so that is where, so it is good. It is good, and political scientists were freaking out the past couple of weeks by emailing the senators, being like, no, you must impeach. You must impeach because it's a censure, right? It's a deterrent. Like, even if it doesn't end up in a conviction, again, something happens, you have to say it's bad because that constructs norms, right? And so that was useful. And then also the FBI. And then again, like I said, this court case, all of that will be kind of helpful. I just think we were hoping that the Republicans would stand against or condemn this in more forceful language, because like I said, with elites, like that matters. So the voters kind of cue to those. Now, okay, how do you fix people? So, okay, you can't get people to learn new facts, and especially the conspiracy theorists, you're never gonna really access, right? Or at least we aren't, by creating fact check databases. Like a family member could maybe bring them to the light, or maybe the disappointment as seeing the conspiracies not unfold anymore. They might learn. They might be like, well, I believe it's like normal cult members or Scientology members. Like folks do break out of it because eventually it's enough. So that could still happen, right? So like that small proportion is kind of gone, right? And also remember that this is fun for conspiracy theorists. So I don't know what you guys have been doing in the pandemic, but I'm sure you've seen that there are these kind of, hunt the killer boxes, or like puzzle boxes where you can you buy them, and then each month they send you a box and you have to figure out who done it. It's basically like a board game. It's kind of an interactive board game. And QAnon conspiracy theorists are basically playing these board games, except they think they're helping society. They think society is being tricked, and by looking for the number 17 in all official photos, they actually believe they're helping, which is why conspiracy theorists are completely different than people who like, well, I don't know if this is fake or not. This is, but I want to be in power and stuff. But what you can do, if people you can't force feed facts to them. You also can't broadcast, we're not an authoritarian country where we can shut off Fox News and just broadcast the truth and hope everyone gets stuff. But what you can do is you can change society, right? So you can change society to make it costly to lie. You can change society such that, you take away like these, like Breitbart, you fine Breitbart, you force Trump on his own platform instead of giving it platforms on the mainstream media, right? Because if you can change, the person won't change, but if the context around them changes, if it is no longer okay, people are getting prosecuted for being racist on Twitter, then folks will stop, right? They respond to their external environment much more than necessarily they respond to someone telling them that they're wrong. They need new information, right? So I think Biden's actually doing a lot to fix this, especially, using, he has 2 years before potentially we lose it. And there's a good chance that we'll lose we'll lose Congress. But the seeing people of color in positions of power, right? That is huge, because then what you do is you set the standard that this is okay, this is normal. Folks are not going to like it, especially folks who think those positions should go to a white man instead of a POC female. But the more it becomes commonplace, the more that the average population gets used to this, the harder it is, or the more that they'll find that their views are in the minority, right? So it's stuff like that. So it's kind of structurally changing society such that racism is not tolerated, or, they're just going to have to get used to the fact that there are all sorts of different individuals in power. They have to get used to the fact that, guess what? You cannot storm the Capitol. You will get arrested. If you arrest the people who commit these acts, most, like 9 out of 10 of the folks who maybe would have will not, right? There's a whole separate issue with policing. Like, yeah, the fact that there were lots of, there are lots of far right extremist individuals in the police forces that are sympathetic to these. And obviously, like, there's racial disparities in policing. That also needs to be, there's a whole bunch of things, which is why at the end of the day, it's not fake news. These are structural problems with society that are grievances, and then fake news helps inflame those grievances, and then social media helps those grievances organize on the ground. So it's a lot of stuff, and that's why you're gonna have to fix society. Like, just taking away taking away Twitter helps, but again, how many people were on Twitter? 25%, right? Are the real, are the Trump voters the majority of people on Twitter? No, right? They're in these little towns where they're not part of this mainstream worrying about democracy norms. They have their own lives going on. So it's going to take a lot to fix. There's a lot of interconnected stuff, which makes it hard.
Vivian has one last question, and then I think we will call it an evening because we have gone way past the half hour of questions I said we would do.
Thank you for the extra half hour. Thank you, Ali. Great to see all of you. Good to see you again, Katie. But anyway, I just wondered if you could also sort of clarify one early thing for me, Ali. When you talked about misinformation, disinformation, and misperceptions, your misperception definition started with factual beliefs. I don't understand how they can be factual.
Okay. So
is it the fact that they hold them? The fact that they hold them, or
the
or
fact
is it just
that they believe that it's?
Maybe I made a typo on the slide. So I'll review the slide to make sure the language is clear. But yeah, so misperceptions are basically an incorrect view of the world, right? So it's an incorrect view of the world. But sometimes these, and this is why it gets tricky, which is why the definitions are, they're all over the place, is that your misperception a lot of times is based on fake news, but it also could be based on, something like Brexit, where it's not necessarily fake news. There are facts, someone calculated. So the best example of kind of a misperception that started as misinformation and then kind of shifted to fake news was the 350 million pounds a week, the Brexit bust. Do you guys remember that? Where because I was in London when the Brexit campaign happened. I was living there. And this was a huge narrative that was like, if we withdraw from the EU, all the money that we pay to the EU or the value of being the EU, we can take it back and give it to the healthcare system, right? An extremely powerful narrative. And voters like that, right? That sounds good. Like, everyone, the NHS is notoriously overworked. That sounds great. Now, that 350 million figure to begin with, so that was calculated based on facts. However, it was not calculated with kind of the standard way that you calculated net inflows and outflows to the EU. So yes, the UK paid money to the EU, but they got back a lot of things that weren't just subsidies. They got reduced tariffs, which increased industry. They got the ability to move around, which increased the employment rate, which then saves the country money. But the way they calculated it, that 350 million pounds figure, they didn't make it up out of thin air, but they took a spreadsheet of numbers and selectively.
Sure.
So anyway, so that when they first did it, I actually don't think, because I've used this as a case in class, like, it wasn't clear. I think it was just someone in Whitehall not understanding the EU and how it works.
Well, it was just too tempting. I think it was too tempting when that person in Whitehall started to run those numbers, perhaps.
Oh yeah, completely, right? You're like, oh, that sounds good. Let's use that one. I mean, actually, the UK government today came out with a stay-at-home cartoon, which is insanely bad. It's like, stay at home, save lives. And it shows 4 little cartoon people, 4 little houses. One house is a woman teaching her children homeschooling. Another house is a woman and a child doing cleaning. Another house is like a woman cooking. The fourth house is a woman and a man watching a movie where the man has like trash and stuff on the floor. It is literally, it's reinforcing gender stereotypes that women are taking care of most of the work pandemic. The only male that's in this, anyway. So the UK is notorious for letting stuff out that clearly was never vetted by anyone except like an Etonian who thought, oh, of course women do housework. Let's send it out to the whole world. But anyway, but that 350, that figure was then later deemed to be incorrect. That it wasn't the official calculation. Then Boris Johnson kept using it. So that's when it switches from misinformation, which is, wrong, but in an innocuous way and based on real things. So this was not, to fake news, where they knew that this was not the official metric. Like the National Statistics Organization said, don't use this, it's misleading, which then created a misperception about the cost of the EU and the benefits that they would get, right? But I agree, it's
Okay.
But this is also why fake news is used for everything, because figuring out what the intent behind something is, a lot of politicians are now saying, well, I said I really thought that there might be electoral fraud when I shared this. Then it turns out there wasn't,
Right.
knowing full well what it does when they share it. So there's a lot of backpedaling that people can do, which makes defining fake news really hard from an academic perspective. It's a slippery little thing.
Yeah.
And the very best lie is the one that just has a little tiny piece of the truth in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just the
Mhm.
tiniest piece that you can build on.
Yeah, exactly. And folks know that, and they use that all the time, right? Like aliens coming down and rigging the election, not believable. But the idea that maybe like a machine, or that so-and-so tossed ballots, especially with some of the electoral fraud concerns in the US, folks did see people tossing ballots. That plus being primed with an elite that's saying they're screwing over our party, you put that together, you never realize that those ballots were the spare ones that were not used, and they're supposed to be destroyed at the end of the election by law. So people put them together, and then also no one likes to be wrong. No one likes to get on TV. No one wants to be a witness and then have their moment in the sun and then be, SNL did some really great clips of, the crazy witnesses that they brought in on the electoral fraud. That was an opening monologue. One was completely intoxicated and had no idea what she was talking about.
And she's just announced to run for a local election.
Oh, of course she did. Of course she did.
Oh, good.
Right?
The concern about tossing ballots is why I still have GPP ballots in. They're packed now, but I still have them, blank GPP ballots. I don't know when I'll get rid of them. From our global presidential primary. Sorry, Allie. Everyone here, everyone else on the call knew what GPP meant. And then I was like, oh,
Yeah,
wait,
everyone's
she's
nodding.
not in DA. So
Yeah.
And
But okay, well, anyway, it's been lovely to speak to you today. I'll send Liz the slides. And if you're interested more in fake news, on my website, under the teaching tab, I have my syllabus for fake news. It's going to be updated in about a week, so you might want to wait to click it. But a lot of kind of easy, accessible resources and kind of articles you can read about, kind of a running list. So
I'll include the link to her website in the email when I send out the slides and the video.
Perfect.
Thanks, Allie.
Thanks
A lot.
for
It was
all
really
the
good.
work you guys do in Switzerland, keeping, we love Democrats abroad. And I know that the DNC was super counting on all of your guys' votes. Like you were one of the populations that they were proud of. They're like, okay, we can count on these Dems. We can count on these. So thanks for all the work you do overseas.
Thank
We provided the margin in Georgia and Arizona where I'm sitting. Both cases, we had
Really?
18 or
Cool.
19,000 votes. Both cases, Biden's margin was 11 or 12,000.
Right.
So in both of those cases, we won it. Of course, you have to talk to the Navajo here in Arizona who turned out like never before, and they think they won Arizona. And then you can talk to the AAPI community in Georgia, which turned out like never before, and they think we won it. But it's okay, we'll take credit for it.
It all matters.
It's all of you together. You needed everyone, otherwise it wouldn't
you
happen.
needed everyone. Like if one of you pulled out, But hey, Interior Secretary is a Native American. Good job, Biden. Good job. I need to go to another meeting, but it was great seeing you guys.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.